Thank you all for coming to our last speaker series for the winter spring season. We have a surprise one coming up in the fall with John Seabrook. He'll be talking about his latest book, but that date is still to be determined. But we're excited to present today our own Collin Ramsey. He has earned a bachelor's degree in history from Rowan University, accompanied by minors in anthropology and international studies. His area of expertise is fascism in World War II. Collin is an active docent at the John Dubois Maritime Museum at the Cumberland County Historical Society. Collin presented his exhibit, Sailing the Seas of Persuasion, World War II Propaganda and the Maritime Community at the Historical Society's Internship Final Event in spring of 2024. Thank you.
So today, as we said, my last presentation was on propaganda and maritime communities, and since I've continued to research propaganda, especially when it comes to World War II, I figured I'd change it up a little bit and not just focus on the maritime community, but focus on it more in general, and maybe try to give you guys more of a global perspective, hearing about propaganda and how it was from other countries as well. Unfortunately, I don't have resources like that available here, from the other countries, but we do have a lot of U.S. propaganda, so we're going to just be going over that, and yeah, let's get into it. So, what is propaganda? All right, so good question. It's the spreading of ideas and information to gather support for a cause or institution. So, mainly used by people to just kind of get a following and to get people united. You want to stay together. You want to have that unity, pushing towards a common goal. So, in the case of World War II, a lot of the U.S. propaganda was aimed towards that said unity and that nationalism and the United States patriotism. So, let's see. Yes. So most of them had to deal with images, slogans, and use symbolism to kind of convey those messages that they wanted. And a lot of them came in the form of posters, but also utilized, radio at the time was huge, as it was a newer technology that people were using more and more as it became more affordable. So that was another huge one. Television, so we're going to be going over a little bit more of that. But before I get to that, I just wanted to say what some of the goals of propaganda were. So obviously, uniting people, right, as we established. You guys have probably heard, house divided cannot stand. So let's get all the people together and kind of aim towards one goal. And in the case of the United States, defeating the Axis powers. So let's see, boosting morale so that way citizens had a positive view of the war. So not just, all right, we're sending people over there, brothers are going over there to fight and, may pass, but let's not focus on that. Let's focus on, how we're doing, how we're contributing, and really try to get everybody on the same page about it. So one of the ways they did that was through recruitment, because if you show people dying overseas, it's probably not going to get a lot of people to want to join your cause. So going and putting up these recruitment posters all over definitely helped. And the U.S. was not the only country that did that. All countries pretty much do that to try to get more military, more bodies, more soldiers that they can send out and either defend, their country or go invade others. Buying war bonds is another big one. Stimulating the economy in times of war. The government's putting all that money towards their resources to build and produce machinery, and then, to pay people to fight in the war. So going off of that, you need people to still stimulate the economy while they're home. So buying war bonds was a crucial part of that. And a lot of the posters that you see, from this time period, a lot of them revolve around dehumanization. Um, so, whether that's like caricatures a lot of times. I don't know how many of you were here for the other exhibit, but in the Maritime Museum, we do have this painting of Hitler and Tojo, and pretty much just racist caricatures. Um, Hitler has a huge nose, Tojo's eyes are just slants, so kind of taking those um, negative stereotypes and emphasizing that really builds on, and that happens with a lot of propaganda, unfortunately. During wartime happens, not just, during World War II and the Rwandan genocide, like people over there, it was a civil war, and they were going back and forth calling each other cockroaches, you're not human, take that human out of the equation, makes it easier to kind of kill, right? You squish a bug, if there's a mouse, instead of mouse trap, you're not going to think twice about it. So kind of dehumanizing people was an easy way to get people to think lesser of the opposition and make it easier for them to get behind the cause. So, as I said, posters were very, very common. According to Oklahoma State University, the United States alone had posters with over 200,000 designs. So people were constantly creating new ones, new ideas, but most of them kind of revolved around the same kind of goal. So a lot of it, conservation was huge. So all the resources the country has, the more you limit yourselves at home, the more you can use abroad, right? So you guys look over here, we have this guy. So your scrap brought it down, keep scrapping, rubber, metal, rags, give to a collector, salvage depot, or sell to a dealer. So, pretty much anything that you're using is going to be valuable to the war effort. And a lot of people did that. And it wasn't just that, just those things, but, a very big emphasis was on that. So the rubber, obviously, you would use for tires, things like that for the military vehicles, the tank trays. You're gonna need this. Metal, how else are we gonna build planes? So out of the tin and everything, conserve as much as you have. Don't go buy any excess, things of that nature. And to further that point, we have this one here. Talks about how many pounds of rubber are used to build each of these. So for a gas mask, you're at a little over 1 pound. A life raft to use for the Navy is 17 to 100, depending on, obviously how big the raft is. Scout cars require 306 pounds, and then heavy duty bombers is 1,825 pounds. So, it sounds like a lot when you get up to the higher numbers, but think about how much, if each person in your town donated just a pound of rubber, you probably have a good amount to help. So it's very important for the government to get things out like this to really show people that what you're doing at home is making a difference and to kind of promote that. And the feeling of going all together and having everyone, like I said, in your town kind of collaborate and go towards this kind of unifies everybody. You get in that spirit of patriotism and nationalism, and you have pride in what you're doing, So it's another example there. And then, yes, another one on conservation. There's many. I have 3 examples just to kind of show you guys that this was such a large thing that the government focused on. All right, and this one says, I'll carry mine too. Trucks and tires must last till victory. So it also shows that not only were men targeted, and women, everybody in the community. Walking to get your groceries. Don't take your don't take your trucks, don't take your cars. You can use those for the war effort instead. And by doing that, obviously, like I said, it kind of just brings people together. You can take it to a collector, salvage depot, anybody, and they're going to give it to the government, and they're going to have those connections to get it to the right places. Let's see. Other ones that posters focused on, war about buying war bonds to stimulate the economy, which I have this one here. I don't know if you guys can see this back there. But it says, don't let that shadow touch them. Buy war bonds, and you can see there's a swastika in the back overshadowing the kids. So, you know, I think it's pretty powerful when you look at it because it shows the enemy is kind of approaching, you know, and they want to show you that not only are you not safe, your kids aren't safe. And I'm sure anyone with kids would understand that, you know, it's a super scary thing, you know, you want the best for them. It's obviously not going to be that. But by producing things like this, they were able to kind of get more people's emotions involved. You know, you want to evoke emotions with propaganda, so that way it kind of hits home. It's not just slogans, it's not just words. You're able to see things like this and have it really mean something. And combining that with buying war bonds, you know, you're going to help your kid's future if you do that. All right, it's pretty much one of the messages in this one. So it's pretty important that the government got all these out there. Because again, without that, we're kind of struggling a little bit financially to get everything going for them. All right, producing all these things. Another kind of medium that a lot of people used were cartoons. So, you know, comic books or just drawings. And according to the University of California, San Diego, Dr. Seuss was responsible for creating around 200 political cartoons. And I use him as an example because most people probably know Dr. Seuss. But many people may not know that, you know, he played a role in creating propaganda for the U.S. As mentioned previously as well, radio. You could give updates, you know, you would hear the president on the radio telling you what's going on, or any other staff members like that, government officials. They'd kind of be able to tell you, hey, we're pushing them back over here. We need your help in the Pacific, you know, keep conserving everything. So these same kind of messages that you see from the posters, they'd also be saying through the radio. So that way, you know, you're getting hit with it left and right. You're going to be more willing to give in and kind of get behind that cause. Let's see, television as well played a good part in there. You know, Hollywood wasn't exempt from creating propaganda. There's actually a Three Stooges episode named You Nasty Spy, but nasty is Nazty. So obviously it was under Nazi. And that was in 1940, so America wasn't even in the war fully yet. But, you know, just to downplay and kind of poke fun at the German government, saying how stupid they are. You know, we're not like that, obviously. But yeah, that was an example of the US one. I also wrote down that Germany happened to use this a lot as well. So Hitler commissioned Leni Riefenstahl to create Triumph of the Will. And that was in 1935. And that's basically just a German propaganda film saying, hey, look how good we are. Look how many soldiers we have. Look at our strong leader. And it was pretty much just clips of speeches, either from Hitler, Rudolf Hess, another large German official, and many shots of soldiers, the SA, the SS, kind of lining up. And it was around like 700,000 people in one shot. Excuse me. But it just kind of shows that we're not the only ones kind of creating this, that everyone across the world is also using this technology. Wartime cinema, so that's another example of people kind of using technology. Britain was kind of known for doing this, having actual photographers and people recording out on the battlefield and kind of recording everything that's going on, not for only for historical purposes, but say the British are winning in a battle, it's going to make them look a lot better. Send that to people at home. We're going to show them, oh, all right, everything we're doing, you know, is for the betterment of us, and we're winning. So obviously that's the goal in wartime. So it kind of helps with that. Excuse me, sorry guys. So who created most of these posters, right? Obviously they're all from the US, so had to come from some US government officials. It was all the Office of War Information that was responsible for, getting into Hollywood, helping with propaganda there, disseminating all of the posters. And, a lot of themes were conservation, war bonds, women having a role in the war effort, whether at home, or the very few that were abroad. Loose lips sink ships was another huge one. So watching what you're saying, you never know when the enemy is around listening. Not giving up valuable information like that. And that's mostly the U.S. ones. Obviously, those are like the kind of themes that the U.S. has here. Over in Germany, they had a minister of propaganda, which was Joseph Goebbels, and he prioritized mostly anti-Semitism, Aryan supremacy, and overall, Germany just had a lot of hate speeches from a lot of their government officials, unfortunately. But those were just three themes that Germany kind of used for it. Like I said previously, with the Triumph of the Will movie that they had, kind of shows, all right, this is who we are. We have a strong leader. This is all the people that we have willing to fight for us. And some of the German propaganda, you could even use Mein Kampf, Hitler's book that he wrote in jail, as a piece of propaganda because it was disseminated to everybody pretty much once he became chancellor. And so he was, since he disseminated that everywhere, a lot of people had access to it. A lot of people are reading these ideas that he has, specifically just, Aryan supremacy, racism. Another one that he had was Lebensraum, which is living space, as would be like a translation for it. That was pretty much the area east of Germany. So he would go out, his whole plan, take that land for Germany. So Poland, even into Russia. And, he was talking about it back then. And later on, when Operation Barbarossa happened, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, they would say it was for that Lebensraum, for living space for German people. And that's kind of the propaganda that they were fed, saying, this is for us, this is what we need. We have to defend this area from Bolshevism, from Jewish people. And that's kind of why they were attacking. They kind of tried to frame it as more of a defensive war, which we know isn't the case. Let me see here. The Soviet Union. So a lot of their propaganda just focused on recruitment. Since they have so many millions of people living there, they were, stretching, a lot of people from the West where the war was happening for them on the Western side. They would get a lot of recruitment there, a lot of soldiers. So they would push over that way towards Germany. But when people kept, passing away and dying as they do in war, they had to kind of recruit more from Central and East. So people even from like Siberia would have to be shipped over there to the West and trying to get people for that. It's kind of tough, and having to put that much of resources and time into transferring these people. But they made sure it was a point because they needed more bodies there. They needed to continue to work back the Germans in the West. So a lot of their recruitment, a lot of the propaganda just focused on that recruitment of people. And all their stuff was obviously just spread from their government officials. The government itself, we really don't have many resources telling us exactly where it came from. One other thing that happened with the Soviet propaganda was that a lot of it kind of had people working together. Sometimes it would have people at home like smiling, saying, "Oh, we know we're doing our part pretty much to help the guys at war." That was kind of to coincide with the communist idea of everybody working together. So I thought that was interesting. For Britain, their Ministry of Information was the one who kind of worked on all their propaganda. They used similar tactics as the U.S. With radio and posters. And you guys have probably seen like "Keep Calm and Carry On," that kind of thing. That actually came from London when they were under siege, but from German bombings. So, a lot of these guys living there would be going to work during the day in the factories, trying to manufacture things for war. And at nighttime, German planes would come in, sirens would sound, and they'd have to try to man the artillery defense. And obviously, that's a scary situation for anybody. So having that motto of keep calm and carry on, just keep doing what you're doing, and see it through. That was kind of their main focus for the propaganda, especially as we got later into the war. For Japan, Hirohito's government was responsible for taking all their propaganda and pushing that to their people, which at the time included all of Japan, parts of China, Manchuria, and the Korean Peninsula as well. So a lot of theirs kind of focused on dehumanizing Westerners, and I mentioned the dehumanization earlier. In Japan's case, they kind of portrayed Westerners as oni, which is like a demon. So I have this piece here. Now this one that I'm going to show you is actually an American piece. But you can see in this one there's Nazis and Japanese people getting pretty much swallowed up by the devil. However, I thought it was pretty good representation of kind of how the Japanese would draw like Western people and kind of say they're demons. This is kind of stuff they would do, and they would just, talk real bad about that. One other thing they've had was recruitment as well, especially because they had limited resources, being an island nation. So that's kind of the purpose for a lot of their expansion. But getting the people to go and be on your side, especially after you take over a lot of their territory, can be tough. So, taking advantage of the ones that could do that or were willing to is a very big thing for them. So, yeah, and then that's kind of how it is for just, most of the countries that were very involved in the war. I didn't want to mention like France as much, because they were obviously taken over pretty quickly by the Germans. So I figured I'd just kind of throw out the major players in there. But obviously this did happen in France as well, whether it was German occupied France or by the French government who sought asylum over in Britain. And also anywhere else that was there. China had a bunch too. Even India, being a British territory at the time, they were experiencing their own propaganda. Australia, New Zealand, both of those as well. So kind of shows that everybody uses it. Yeah, it's a tool for everybody. And there's various ways that they can kind of get their points across. The impact of it, I would say, is just overall how many people that it touched and how many people it affected. Obviously, in the West here, we kind of set the tone going forward. So the Allies win, the Axis is no more, and it kind of gives a lot more credibility kind of to the Allies propaganda, saying, we can defeat them, keep doing this, keep conserving, buy war bonds, do your part at home, all that kind of didn't materialize into nothing. It materialized into a win for the Allies. So I think that kind of gave a lot more credibility, like I said, to the government, and people were kind of more trusting. There was a sense of patriotism. Hey, we won. We did this. And it was because we all worked together. So I thought that was very important to mention. One other thing it impacted was just racism in general during that time. I mentioned the dehumanization on two different fronts. People did it on both sides, but obviously reinforcing those negative stereotypes and dehumanizing people is never really good. Moral thing to do. But again, it happened. And it wasn't just, us against other countries or, us against Japan, Germans against us. It was kind of all intermingled. And even the U.S. itself, African Americans weren't fully segregated, or they were segregated until I believe it was 1948 was the official desegregation of everything, all the military branches. Until then, the Army, African Americans could still be a part of it, but they had their own segregated units, so they were by themselves. So obviously, probably weren't getting treated the best. And then I read that in the Navy, according to the U.S. Naval Institute, there were African American sailors, around 4,000 before we got involved in the war, and it jumped to 5,000 afterwards. But for most of them, there was really only a small handful that were doing actual work, as far as going out and, manning the guns and helping to sail. A lot of them were considered seagoing bellhops, so they were kind of just taking orders and doing those kinds of things for everyone else in the Navy, which I think speaks a lot to, the state of the country at the time and the state of the world as well. And then in the Air Force, the Tuskegee Airmen, obviously, were around in 1941. So, they were able to still be, it was a segregated unit. However, they were still able to go into combat and do things. I wasn't able to find, unfortunately, a solid number on how many African Americans were in the Air Force, but I thought it was important to note that they were there as well. And like I said, that all changed in 1948 after President Truman signed an executive order kind of desegregating all the military branches and saying, we're all in this together. If you guys fall alongside us, here we are, right? So yeah, that's pretty much all the information I have for you guys right now. I have just some questions that I kind of want you guys to think about. So the first one being, is propaganda positive or only negative? A lot of times we think propaganda has such a negative connotation. It didn't used to be that way until around World War I, when it was kind of being used more and more for war and more available to people. So I think, it's important to ask ourselves that. We also have, what is the line between propaganda and misinformation? So, clearly there's got to be a divide there. Where would you guys put that? And the final is propaganda ethical? Is it like manipulative, or is it a necessity? So you guys can talk about it if you want. There's no right or wrong answer, but figure I'll throw those out there as something to think about. And then the only last question I have is, what are some cases or instances of propaganda that you see today? Because obviously, thankfully, we're not in wartime right now. But it's still out there. We're still seeing it. I'm sure you guys probably see some on social media or something. So just wanted to send those questions to you guys. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Anyone have any questions?
The comment that you found is important. Negative, the propaganda is about
Yeah, because they have the most power to kind of put that out there. I think it's probably the biggest reason, but yeah, definitely it makes a lot of sense.
interesting during the war how our propaganda machine had to do a flip flop halfway through the war. Russia allied with the Germans.
Yeah.
Barbarossa happened, and all of a sudden, Russia was one of the three democracies.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. China's another one that kind of flips too, halfway. But yeah, I definitely see it. It is interesting to know how they do flip like that, because you're pumping out all of this stuff opposing one side, and the next minute you're friends. So you have to kind of go over that. I know there was an example I had seen. It was British propaganda, and it was a British guy, an Australian, an Indian, and it was like all these guys are your friends, So imagine one like that where you have Germany, Japan, and Russia, and then or the Soviet Union, and then you kind of lose that last one there, So having to take down all those ones, and create new ones for it is definitely an interesting topic.
listening to your talk, at the time that this propaganda was being used, it was the whole, all of America was being mobilized.
Mhm.
We went from having a very small army to a much bigger one. It happened to happen. Had to happen suddenly
Oh, yeah.
to meet the challenge. And also, I think there was, I imagine there was a lot of, they had to sort of cut through. We all live with information floating around, so they had to cut through with, really striking and dramatic scenes like on these posters and everything. But it was a time that I think we look back now with admiration of what our society was then. And I really wonder, could we mobilize in this way again? Is it something that will be called on now in the future?
Mhm.
I wonder about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. We definitely have different like social and political things going on now than we did back then. The different viewpoints and such. But yeah, no, it is a very interesting question. And what you're saying about the rapid mobilization, especially for all the armed forces, a lot of that stems or kind of connects to conservation of materials. After Pearl Harbor, we didn't have our naval fleet over there. The Army and the Navy wasn't the largest in the world, relatively smaller. But after that, they started, building that up. The naval fleet headquarters went down to San Diego, and a lot of that was going there. A lot of the metal, a lot of the rubber, things like that. So that way we would be able to have, an admirable Navy, especially in the Pacific, and a good presence there.
Yeah, we went at that time, we were a small power. Now, then that was 80 years ago.
Mhm.
But now we're managing the entire globe in a way. And now we're sort of, with Trump, his viewpoint on things to reduce that. So we live in interesting times.
Definitely, yeah. There's a lot that could be said there, but I'm going to leave that for you guys. But I will say, hegemonic powers don't stay that way forever. So, things change, whether that be from the leaders or other factors, but it will be interesting to see how we move forward from here.
Yeah.
Question?
Obviously more than okay if you don't know the answers. These are a bit tangential, but towards the end, you mentioned the segregation in the U.S. military, and I'm curious if you know anything, if the collection of materials was also segregated, or if it was like, these are from Black people and Black families, they're going to these specific, I wonder if they took the segregation that seriously in that moment,
Gotcha.
to what extent.
Yeah.
And then the other thing was, I think this is just in my mind because I'm doing lots of consumerism in the 50s and 60s right now. And I'm so curious how they transition to, we need to save, we need to be thrifty, we need to do all these things. And within a decade or two, go into mass consumption and waste, especially with plastic. Especially because my thought process is, we're still in a war, the Cold War is different, but I don't know. That was more of a statement than a question, but I'm just very curious how the transition from, we need to save all of this, to, we could just throw it out.
Gotcha. So to hit on the first part of that, to my knowledge and my research, I didn't see anything saying that, conservation efforts were segregated at all. It kind of just targeted everybody. Again, most of the posters probably have, white men and women on there, but it was still around in African American communities as well. So yeah, I don't think there was any specific site that they would have to go to, aside from just their local one, whatever was already designated. And then for that other part of your question, the latter, honestly, I think it's probably just because you don't see, even despite being in the Cold War afterwards, you don't see that active wartime. You're not sending your brothers, or you're not seeing, people go out there and fight. So I'm thinking, everyone was conserving and conserving, and then they're like, oh, we're free, we don't have to do this anymore. And that kind of probably led to, yeah, we can just, kind of go from there, yeah, there's not as much of a need now, so you take that need away, people are probably just gonna go back to living the best life that they can. So that's kind of how I would see that going, but again, that was my research part, that's my opinion on it.
I think it's really interesting, when we're talking World War II, the propaganda was very controlled. The production of propaganda was very controlled. Governments decided what their citizens would see and think and feel. Whereas now, our propaganda today is generated by the public. You can't go on social media, they've got memes for this, and, it's everywhere, and it's generated by us. So I think without that control, it's probably part of the reason that we're all able to say opinion-wise and thought and belief and value-wise is because we're not controlled. We're just left to make our own and follow whomever we want. You can believe, that the chickens will rule one day and somebody will believe you. You will find those people. So I think it's interesting, and it'll be interesting for the historians later on, if we get that way, for them to look at the time now and see how propaganda in and of itself is changed by whose hand is polluting it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I definitely get what you're saying there. I do think the government still does play like a big role with propaganda, especially, pushing things online. I don't know if you guys were on Twitter before Elon took over, but I see so much more propaganda on there now. Like every 3 or 4 posts is like a pro-right kind of tweet, and before it was just for fun, it was whatever.
And you can see it's the foreign governments also manipulating our social media.
Oh,
People
absolutely.
don't realize it.
Yeah, and countries like China, I know they have an intranet, not an internet, so all their stuff is government controlled anyway. So you choose, they're choosing what you're seeing. Whereas thankfully we don't have that, we can kind of see other sides of it and people's opposing views. But I think, the government still put out for, pay people money to say this, they have this many followers. All right, when you say this, it's going to reach a lot more people. So I think it does still play a part in it, but I do definitely see what you're saying about people, throwing memes up and, making fun of either side and going at it that way.
And I wonder what kind of impact that makes, and you know what I mean? And did the people during the war recognize that they're looking at propaganda and not having negative connotation to that word as we do now? Because I don't know that we today recognize what we're seeing as propaganda.
So I feel like one of the uses of propaganda is obviously, to kind of sway them one way or the other, but it wasn't more of like a occasional, oh, I see this, and it's kind of out of the ordinary. This poster's hanging up at work, but there would be multiple. Like you'd be bombarded by it. So it would be, at the supermarket, at work. You probably see something driving home. Any store you go to is probably going to have stuff put on the side, or inside. So that way you're going to be seeing it more often. So I think people would be just say less aware that hey, maybe this is propaganda here, as opposed to hey, this is just how it is, kind of deal.
Yeah, it's more, it's just a comment on what Desiree said, but like this idea of like information literacy and like things that we're taught for like if like the website is .org or .gov or stuff like that, and stuff that we learned when the internet just came to be, and how to trust different sources, just how that plays a role within the World War II propaganda. But I feel like the propaganda maybe, and I'm probably speaking like not making sense, but I'm just thinking like this is, like you said, the term propaganda literally means like to unify, to bring people together, to do something or believe something. And I'm thinking just like the posters to unify, the propaganda is unifying you to help with the war efforts, that everyone is experiencing this war in some way, shape or form. So it's kind of like encouraging people to play their part, or you're going to be shamed. I think of that one poster with like the dad sitting on the chair with the two kids, and they're like, "Dad, what did you do during the war?" But yeah, it wasn't really a question. It was just more thinking out loud.
No, definitely. I think there's like, that social aspect of it too. And there's cases where people, instead of, conserving and, putting this at the salvage depot, people were hoarding. Certain people would just say, you know what, I have this food and, this metal, but I need that. That's for me. Like, what if we don't have any? And a lot of times those people will be fined, or thrown in jail if they, it continues. So definitely that social component of it, what you're saying, like, what did you do during the war? It's gonna make you be like, oh, I don't want to be a bad example or tell my kids I was thrown in jail for doing that. So I think that is another big component of it too.
This is also more of a comment than a question, but what you just said is so interesting. The idea that like in the 40s, it's like we have to come together and be this united front and take care of each other in the war, and then immediately just this switch to more like self-centered capitalist individualism. And the point that I was really going for was you have this idea of like we all need to come together and collectively take care of our nation and all this stuff, and then they're like, but socialism's bad, like immediately after.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, it's a little weird how that works.
Not that way though. A little different.
Yeah, a little bit less intense, I'd say. Yeah.
When did America start really seeing Nazi Germany as a negative group?
Probably, I'd say after the invasion of Poland in 1939.
Okay.
Seeing, I mean, obviously, U.S. is not involved in the war yet, but we still know what's happening. We know the international dealings. But I mean, certain people probably said, the remilitarization of the Rhineland was probably, a big red flag, but no country kind of did anything about it. The Treaty of Versailles violated, but there's no follow-up. So it's like, okay, well, everyone's too focused on themselves right now after World War I, kind of rebuilding still. So I think it's just a little bit kind of.
Yeah, and I just asked because like I don't have a lot of background in World War II history, like the social stuff and not. So because I was thinking about with the Three Stooges doing a thing against, and I was thinking how it's even more so meant for them as three Jewish men too, to make this skit against Nazi Germany as well.
For sure. Definitely, yeah. And obviously being one of the groups affected most and targeted by the German government, probably enjoyed making that one. But yeah, I mean, those feelings were around, prior to the U.S. entering the war. I mean, I'm sure, there's wars going on right now. You guys probably have an opinion on which side, you would take. So, you see and kind of, if you can bring yourself back in time that way and hear about all these things that are going on, probably wouldn't be pro-Germany either. Although, to be fair, there were some Americans that were. We had a German-American Bund rally in Madison Square Garden, and a lot of people came in. There was a large flag with George Washington on there and a swastika right behind him. So, which is completely, un-American in my opinion. But
was that in 1939?
Yes. Yep. So, not everybody was on the same page about it. Still differing opinions back then. But if it makes you feel any better, a lot of people were protesting outside. I think it was around like 60,000. So, I'm gonna keep it there.
Well, it's interesting to hear you talk about the propaganda, which my mother, internalized, and as she aged and was on her way to losing her grip on reality, she got much more conservationist. Like she would cut the napkins into 4 sections, so we didn't use so many, and these little things that came out from somewhere in her history.
Yeah, and I'm sure that happened, your household and many others too, because it's just kind of how it was, the sign of the times, and going through that, it's, it can't be easy. I think there's a degree of like a traumatic experience there, where it just kind of flips, your life 180, does a 180, just flips around. So I'm sure there's a lot of stories like that out there. Yeah, definitely. But that was interesting. Thank you.
I can't help but think about your comment regarding conservation versus massive consumerism. It's sure a lot of the technology that we gained in World War II and the war efforts, we were used then making like appliances from when, or like we introduced them to the home front for more social uses. That's correct, right? Or
I would imagine so.
yeah.
I mean, I didn't, particularly research that aspect, but that does track in my mind.
I can feel it somewhere in the back file of my brain. But I wonder if like the movement to mass consumerism was adoption of those war like using those new war resources now for something different, but also like the let's celebrate in our victory.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm picturing too, like, obviously I asked the question, I don't know the answer, but like, it makes sense in my brain for them to be like, okay, we did all the hard work. We're celebrating now,
Yeah.
get rid of things.
Get that refrigerator.
But it is interesting to think like, because I'm sure there's been whole things of like consumerism and waste throughout history. But you think back to the Victorian era where a big middle class feminine ideal was being thrifty and saving things.
Yeah.
And then you get into the Great Depression when you have to save things because you're poor, and then wars and all that stuff. And then it's just boom, mass consumerism. Getting rid of everything we don't need.
It kind of just boils down to simple economics, because propaganda is gonna say, listen, we need everything we have to go into the war effort, right? And then once that war effort isn't necessary anymore, then we need to generate as much money movement as possible within the country to maintain our strength. Plus, let's not forget baby boomers, right? So now we have this new population growth that requires money to take care of. So where does that money come from? It comes from, spending money back and forth with each other. And, it's like human nature in our culture to become more individualistic with that. I want this, no, I want this. Well, you can both have what you want. You know what I mean? I think a lot of it boils down to economics.
And they were advertising like, pick like a microwave or a refrigerator in the color you want. What speaks to you? So then you're connecting your identity to the consumer goods.
Makes sense. That's something else about it.
Thank you so much, Collin. Thank you for
One last thing, so if you guys do want to see any more posters like this, the library has an excellent selection. So feel free to check them out. There's tons.
Thank you.